pleasure to be here at the Neue Galerie and to talk about Kandinsky. We are familiar with Kandinsky's art, especially the paintings from the Blaue Reiter period, which you see here. And we know the essential facts of Kandinsky's life: how he was born in Moscow in 1866, lived for extended periods of time in Germany, and died a French citizen in 1944. His art is often divided into distinct periods, based not only on his place of residence, but also on his stylistic development. For example, the colorful, expressionist paintings made in Munich and Murnau before World War I, and the geometric works dating from the Bauhaus years in the 20s and early 30s. And finally, his late work created in Paris from 1934 to 1944, which combined fanciful figurative images with abstract ones. To counteract the tendency to chop up Kandinsky's career into several pieces, some art historians have emphasized recurrent motifs, such as circles. And you can see on the left some circles in watercolors that he painted in 1913, and others on the right in painting circles within a circle, which is in the exhibition that was done 10 years later. The art historian Peg Weiss identified the motif of St. George slaying the dragon in the painting on the left in the black square, with earlier depictions also abstracted of St. George slaying the dragon with his lance in painting with white border. And this is much harder to see because here you can see the lance and a dragon and a hunched over figure, presumably the rider, not so much the horse. Here she felt that this was the dragon, down here a horse, a lance, and a rider, all very abstract. One of his earliest canvases is Trysting Place 1, a fanciful romantic scene where a couple in medieval costume meets outside a castle at dusk. In fact, someone might even doubt that Kandinsky painted Trysting Place, or In the Autumn, the painting that you see on the right, but I assure you that he did. They are both rare early works. The same year, that is in 1901, he made many small oil studies on canvas board. For example, on Binz, an island in the Rügen in the Baltic, where he spent part of the summer, or Akhtirka in the autumn, where he stayed at the country estate of his wife's family in Russia, and several winter scenes of Schwabing, where he lived in Munich. In his studio, Kandinsky painted larger canvases, such as Trysting Place, which is about 3.5 by almost 3 feet. But he made these small oil studies, which are just 9 by 12 inches, outdoors from nature, often applying paint with a palette knife onto the prepared canvas boards. Not only the sizes of the pictures, but also their techniques are different. And from the beginning, he worked in several modes simultaneously. During the summer of 1903, Kandinsky stayed with his student, Gabriele Münter, who had become his girlfriend, in Kalmünz, a medieval town northeast of Munich. He filled sketchbooks with drawings from nature and continued to paint small oil studies. Some of these small oil nature studies he worked into larger canvases. For example, the motif of Kalmünz, stormy weather, which you've been looking at. And this probably originated from the study from nature that you see at the upper left. In addition to views of his surroundings, Kandinsky painted many imaginary scenes in tempera on dark-colored cardboards, such as Crusaders and Wartime, which are on the right. And he made designs for embroideries, for ceramics, and he learned how to make woodcuts. On the right is an early colored woodcut of the singer. His interest in decorative arts and in printmaking really began that summer in Kalmans and continued throughout his life. In August of 1903, when Professor Peter Behrens came to visit Kandinsky in Munich, he saw this large, unfinished picture of a mounted warrior. It's about 3.5 by 5 feet in size. And this was in Kandinsky's studio, and on the basis of seeing it, Behrens offered Kandinsky a position teaching decorative painting at the Kunstgewerbeschule, the Arts and Crafts School in Düsseldorf. Kandinsky declined the offer, probably because he was planning to leave in a few days to go to Russia. And in the following years, during his extensive travels with Gabriele Münter, Kandinsky continued to work in different styles simultaneously, rather than in a single uniform manner. For example, in Tunis, he painted light-filled oil studies of the beach, as well as temperas on black backgrounds of orange cellars, which you see on the right, or Arab horsemen. These tempera paintings he called farbige Zeichnungen, or color drawings, and they stood in contrast to the kleine Ölstudien, the small oil studies, or the Bilder, the large oil paintings on canvas. And Kandinsky cataloged the pictures in separate inventories or lists. In 1906 and 7, Kandinsky and Münter lived in Paris for a year. During that time, he painted colorful life on the left, and also small oil studies of the park at Saint-Cloud. He saw a Gauguin exhibition, Fauve paintings, modern art in galleries, and at the home of Leo and Gertrude Stein. Moreover, he showed his own very different work at the Salon d'Automne in Paris. For much of the time, Kandinsky stayed outside the city in Sèvres, near the park of Saint-Cloud, where he painted his surroundings, as well as many Russian pictures. For example, Colorful Life, a painting of a bear with a Russian peasant defending himself, I guess, with a pitchfork, and down below, a song on Volga. Kandinsky's father came to visit, and he also saw fellow Russian artists that he knew from his years in Munich. Once Gertrude Stein visited Kandinsky in his studio, looked at his tempera paintings, perhaps these, and just smiled. Yet, only a year later, during the summer of 1908, Kandinsky stayed together with Gabriele Münter, Alexei Yavlensky, and Mariana von Werefkin in the small market town of Murnau, just south of Munich. Here at the upper left, you see a view of Murnau that Kandinsky painted out from his room at the inn where they stayed. And in the background, you can see the Bavarian foothills and the meadows where all the four artists would go on excursions and paint landscapes out of doors. The picture on the right, which belongs to the Neue Galerie, Murnau Street with Women, demonstrates the brilliant colors and freely painted brushwork that we associate with Kandinsky's art as it evolved in 1908. In the following years, Kandinsky and Münter returned often to Murnau, where she purchased a house. He continued to paint the town and nearby landscapes. Here is a view of the sunflowers in the garden in front of their house, and the shed and the church in Murnau, and then the castle in the background. The lack of representational elements, the vivid, now naturalistic colors, and the intentional blurring and abstracting of forms are all signs of a gradual movement toward abstraction. At the same time that he painted landscapes in Murnau, Kandinsky began to work on his compositions, a series of large paintings with carefully elaborated motifs expressing spiritual meanings. On the right is the final study for composition 2. Here in the center, riders on horseback are seen against a white vertical form, which divides the canvas into two sides with ominous waves, boats, and at the upper left and figures engulfed by waves down there, also on the left. But in contrast, on the right, there are pairs of reclining figures of lovers, a flowering tree, a sun. So there's a great contrast between the peaceful, idyllic scene on the right and the more ominous one on the left. Unlike most compositions, Kandinsky did not designate a theme for composition 2, although later he described, and I quote him, how he mitigated the tragic element in the composition and drawing by means of more indifferent or totally indifferent colors, and how he involuntarily sought to juxtapose the tragic colors with sublimity of linear form. These different aspects of Kandinsky's art are reflected even in photographs of him taken around 1911. On the left, you see Kandinsky working in the garden in Murnau, whereas on the right, you see him more formally dressed, seated in the middle, together with the members of the Blaue Reiter, Maria and Franz Marc, Bernhard Köhler, the sponsor, Heinrich Campendonk, and Thomas von Hartmann. During the summer of 1911, Kandinsky and Franz Marc began to work on an almanac or yearbook, which would include essays and illustrate works of art and objects from diverse cultures and different centuries. The Blue Reiter Almanac appeared the following year and brought together Kandinsky's text on the question of form, the manuscript for his stage composition, Yellow Sound, for which Thomas von Hartmann composed the music, on the same page as 15th century prints from German Bibles. Van Gogh's portrait of Dr. Gachet was juxtaposed with a Japanese print. Robert Delaunay's Eiffel Tower with El Greco's St. John. A painting by the composer Arnold Schoenberg was seen next to one by Henri Rousseau, followed by votive pictures from churches in Murnau, children's drawings, and popular prints from Russia. In the almanac, contradictions abound and often defy any sense of stylistic coherence. I'm showing on the left the final watercolor study for the cover of the Blue Reiter Almanac that Kandinsky made in September 1911. And on the right, watercolor number 6, which he painted about the same time, where abstract areas of color describe landscape elements in vague terms. Perhaps water down here at the right, a green hill, some red hillocks, probably some foliage or grass there, and there are red, yellow, blue, and green ovals scattered across the surface. Much is unclear, but the degree of abstraction and sense of ambiguity is greater than in his several studies for the cover of the Blaue Reiter Almanac. Once again, the complexity of his art emerges when comparing coeval works. The degree to which Kandinsky's painting had moved toward abstraction became clear in the autumn of 1911 with Composition 5. He later explained that he chose the Last Judgment as the theme of the painting. Only traces of images remain. Angels blowing trumpets at the upper corners, the towers of a walled city here at the top, a boat with oars down at the lower left, and figures of the dead rising from below. Composition 5 is dominated by a thick, curving black line which moves from the upper right down across the large canvas and around toward the center. Some of the motifs are found in his other works depicting the sound of trumpets, the Resurrection, All Saints' Day, and the Last Judgment. When Kandinsky submitted this painting to the New Artists Association in Munich for their third exhibition, it was rejected on the grounds that it was too large, that it exceeded the limit of 4 square meters. But the problem was really the difficulty it presented the viewer in seeing or being able to comprehend the picture. After Composition 5 was rejected, Kandinsky, Marc, and Minter abruptly resigned from the New Artists Association and organized their own exhibition, which took place at the same time. That is the last 2 weeks of December 1911 at Heinrich Tannhauser's Munich Gallery. The official title was the first exhibition of the board of the Blaue Reiter. Incidentally, the Blaue Reiter was not intended to be an exhibition group, but it was only after the split with the New Artists Association that the editors did present 2 exhibitions with works by many of the artists who were included in the almanacs. Kandinsky had painted Composition 5 on November 17, 1911, about the same time that he did this winter scene of Murnau with locomotive. In fact, there are consecutive entries in his inventory or hand list of paintings. Even as he created his series of compositions, improvisations, and impressions, Kandinsky continued to paint landscapes. However, it's relatively easy to recognize the snow-covered tree in the foreground, the black steam engine, houses, dark hills in the background of the Murnau picture, especially in comparison to Composition 5 on the left. By now it comes as no surprise that Kandinsky worked in several styles and in various media simultaneously. At the top you see a small hinterglass build or glass painting of the Angel of the Last Judgment, where the angel's hair and the trumpet and the abstract form below suggest forms in Composition 5. In contrast, the glass painting down at the lower left of Reiter and woman picking apples is reminiscent of the medieval and fairy tale scenes that he had done earlier. The technique of painting the reverse of a small piece of glass came from traditional Bavarian craftsmen. Kandinsky, Minter, and Mark not only collected hinterglass builder, but also adopted the technique and painted decorative frames for their glass paintings. On the right, you see a wood relief that Kandinsky carved and painted at about the same time in 1910, 1911. His interest in folk art, evident in the Blaue Reiter Almanac, also extended to the decorative scenes he painted on simple pine furniture for the Murnau house. And if you go to Murnau, the house where they lived is open as a small museum, and you can see all the furniture as well as some of his paintings. His painting with Black Arch and his Lady in Moscow both date from 1912. The differences between them, the abstract lines and colored shapes in painting with Black Arch, in contrast to the clearly defined figurative aspects of the other picture, speak volumes. But in looking more closely at the painting on the right, the floating figure in black, this strange pink circle next to the lady and her arm, whose arm appears to be severed, are puzzling and rather disturbing. Likewise, the brown form hovering below the arch and the blue one near it, these forms that fill the lower half of the large canvas on the left seem mysterious and are difficult to decipher. These two paintings, I think, demonstrate once again the complexity of Kandinsky's art. They also dispel the prevalent art historical view that Kandinsky moved gradually toward greater and greater abstraction, and that by 1910 or so, he made the great leap forward to abstract art. It wasn't so simple. There's a tendency to think of Kandinsky's art as being a progression, moving toward abstraction, and certainly he wrote about his wish to do away with the object and his dilemma of what was to replace the object. So that moving from the landscape with two poplars to painting with white border, and then culminating in black lines in late 1913. But it was not quite so simple, and certainly his development was not linear. Therefore, I have tried to emphasize pluralism rather than a single style. Soon after Kandinsky completed these 4 canvases that he was commissioned to paint for Edwin Campbell's New York apartment, World War I broke out in August 1st, 1914. As a Russian citizen living in Germany, Kandinsky was an enemy alien, and he had to leave the country within a few days. He and Münter went to Switzerland, but left everything behind. As the war dragged on, Kandinsky returned to Russia and Münter to Germany. Their life was disrupted. He made no oil paintings in 1915, creating only watercolors and drawings. The watercolor on the right, which is dated 1915, is a return to painting with white border from 2 years earlier, whereas the watercolor of a standing woman on the left, one of several that he made, may come as a surprise to those who think the artist's work evolved in a simple line rather than several steps forward, then backwards and sideways. In December 1915, Kandinsky traveled to neutral Sweden, where he met Gabriele Münter and stayed for 3 months. About this time, he painted a series of 14 watercolors that he called Bagatelles. As the name implies, they were small works or trifles. Some bagatelles are fanciful or fairy tale scenes. For example, the watercolor on the left shows 5 female figures in the foreground and suggests a narrative, although no specific legend or fairy tale can be identified. And in the background, it includes familiar motifs: dark clouds, rain, a rainbow, birds, and mountains. Likewise, in the watercolor on the right, the motifs of a boatman standing next to a decorative Viking ship, a bird in a cage, and elegant ladies suggest a fairy tale and are reminiscent of the Song of the Volga that Kandinsky had painted a decade earlier in Paris. However, not all the bagatelles were figurative. Watercolor with black lines on the left and watercolor with small spots on the right stand in contrast to birds in the center. Art historians have often dismissed the bagatelle as potboilers or works that were made to sell. However, throughout all of World War I, Kandinsky's art revealed an ambivalence, even a dichotomy between abstraction and figuration. Or perhaps it's more accurate to say that Kandinsky worked in 2 contradictory styles at the same time. After he returned to Russia, Kandinsky painted many landscapes at Akhtirka during the summer of 1917, as well as the scene of his second wife, Nina Andreevskaya, and her sister Tatiana on the porch of the Abrikosov's dacha. He also painted 3 decorative panels, which are now lost and known only from a drawing, for his former brother-in-law's dacha. In contrast, the painting on the right, Overcast, transforms the landscape elements into an evocative, essentially abstract picture. It was done in September 1917, soon after the painting of Nina, and not long before the October Revolution. The following year, in 1918, Kandinsky did not make any oil paintings, but he did many watercolors as well as glass paintings, which we call the Hinterglasbilder, done in Murnau before the war. With green Reiter, which is on the right and also which you can see upstairs, resembles some of the bagatelle he painted 2 years earlier in Sweden. The artist gave it to Nina Kandinsky's mother, so it was not made to be sold. The untitled watercolor on the left is one of many painted in 1918, where it's all over composition with towers, clouds, mountains, explosions, just vague traces of these images, where they all break free from landscape and swirl into abstraction. Many of the works that Kandinsky did in Russia during the First World War have been overlooked because they do not fit in neatly with what came before or after. And some art historians have criticized me for wanting to show them rather than conveniently ignoring their contradictory aspects. In late December of 1921, Vasily and Nina Kandinsky left Russia, arriving in Berlin on Christmas Eve. There he painted Blue Circle, which you see on the left, and made studies for the murals executed by students that summer for the jury-free exhibition in Berlin. Upstairs you'll find a wonderful recreation of the wall paintings for the Jury-Frei Kunstschau. By late summer, Kandinsky had moved to Weimar, where he taught at the Bauhaus. White Zigzags on the right was done there. Both pictures display the circles, triangles, squares, horn forms, zigzag lines, curving lines that we associate with the artist's Bauhaus work. In fact, the prevalence of geometric forms emerged at the Bauhaus in Weimar and continued when the Bauhaus moved to Dessau, and the circle was to play a dominant role. Kandinsky explained that it was not the form itself, but, and I quote, the inner force of the circle and its countless variations that fascinated him. He wanted the viewer to perceive the inner meaning that lies behind the formal elements. In circles within a circle and several circles, the repetition of circles emphasizes the simplicity of the shape, its precise but inexhaustible variables, to use the artist's own words, a simultaneously stable and unstable form, the single tension that carries countless tensions within it. As he stated, the circle is the synthesis of greatest oppositions. Abstract interpretation presents precise lines and color geometric shapes against a dark ground without specific associations. In contrast, Black Triangle on the right seems to have a few figurative connotations. These triangles can be read as legs. This could be a torso, a head, and here an arm outstretched and holding something. Both of these paintings were done in 1925 when Kandinsky was writing his theoretical treatise, Point and Line to Plane, which drew upon all of his teaching notes and his theoretical pedagogical material for teaching at the Bauhaus. In fact, a drawing after the painting of black lines was reproduced in his book as demonstrating the inner relationship between the complex of straight lines and curves. There were numerous pictures from the late 20s that suggest people or things. Colored sticks on the left resembles a standing figure. Upward brings to mind a head with an arm. Sharp and blunt on the right can be interpreted as a black mountain with moon above. Other pictures show creatures, houses, boats. It's not really far-fetched to find objects in some of Kandinsky's geometric abstractions, although it does appear to be a contradiction for a non-objective artist. In 1929, Kandinsky exhibited his watercolors in Paris, where he also traveled and became more aware of different artists working there. That autumn, he also showed several paintings in an exhibition of abstract and surrealist art in Zurich, including Mild Hardness, the work on the left. The geometric grid, black lines, and structural elements are familiar from his Bauhaus work. But strange pictures, such as Some Red on the right, with its wavering lines and imprecise shapes, raised the question of whether he wanted to break free from the strict geometry and color theory of the Bauhaus. And in an interview published in a French newspaper in 1929, Kandinsky acknowledged the importance of surrealism. And I quote, that surrealism is trying to create a new relationship with nature. And he went on to explain and to contrast surrealist and abstract artists. The difference between these two species is that the surrealist utilizes nature in his work, albeit in a surnatural way, as if it were a plus, whereas the abstract painter omits nature as if it were a minus, end quote. Certainly, Kandinsky was more closely affiliated with the abstract artists. He exhibited with Cercle et Carré Bleu and with Abstraction Création in France, and he published an essay in Cahiers d'Art defending abstract painting. 13 Rectangles exemplifies the purity of form and clarity. Red, yellow, and blue shapes come forward and almost float over a simple tan background. Whereas other paintings, such as Slowly Out or Langsam Heraus on the right, with their intentionally messy backgrounds and textured surfaces, seem to contradict the sharply defined abstract elements. In the summer of 1913, Kandinsky showed works at the Salon des Surindépendants in Paris, together with Hans Arp, Max Ernst, Alberto Giacometti, René Magritte, and Juan Miró. At that time, Arp wrote to Kandinsky, whom he had known for many years, "Your paintings hang beautifully. You lead the surrealist procession," wrote Arp to Kandinsky. This may come as a surprise, since Kandinsky is not considered a surrealist, and he certainly didn't think of himself as one. In fact, he was often critical of their art, and especially their communist leanings. During the summer of 1933, the Bauhaus had closed for good, and the Kandinskys relocated to Paris at the end of the year. His art underwent a dramatic change in palette and imagery. He favored lighter and more delicate color harmonies, especially pastels, and he introduced biological as well as biomorphic forms. Succession, on the right, emphasizes, it consists of four rows with brightly colored, playful shapes interspersed with some curving lines and straight lines. In Paris, Kandinsky also developed a new technique using sand. Striped, which you see on the left, is one of several paintings from 1934 with raised areas of fine sand glued to the canvas and painted. Little birds appear at the upper left and are contrasted with an exclamation point at the right. There are snake-like forms and worms and nematodes and a starfish-like echinoid down below. The worlds of the microscope and the deep sea came to life in Kandinsky's Paris pictures. He included cells, embryos, various natural phenomena. In grouping, there are really insects, probably grasshoppers. And yet, in contrast, yellow painting on the right presents a carefully balanced geometrical and hierarchical structure. Kandinsky could work in two different styles simultaneously, as did Paul Klee, Pablo Picasso, and many other artists. And we think nothing of the fact that Picasso or Gerhard Richter or Andy Warhol worked in different styles at the same time, yet for Kandinsky, it's not so well recognized. Here are two gouaches from about the same time, which emphasize Kandinsky's multiple means of expression. Both are painted on black paper, recalling the works that black runs that I showed earlier this evening. Supports on the left is carefully structured and geometrical, whereas the untitled gouache on the right features fanciful towers, heads, and eyes. We are familiar with certain works by Kandinsky, and we associate certain styles with his art from different periods. It's only through bringing together all the known works by an artist, which you have to do in preparing a catalogue raisonné, or in carefully studying a catalogue raisonné, that we begin to notice the unusual aspects of an artist's career. I'm not going to dwell too much on the Paris period, since it lies beyond the scope of the present exhibition. But like the works done in Russia during the First World War, the pictures painted in Paris after 1934 reflect a time of unrest and impending upheaval. Not only the artist's surroundings, but also his audience and his opportunities to exhibit changed. He negotiated long and hard for Composition 9, which you see on the left, to be acquired by the French state. Not surprisingly, Kandinsky himself, as well as his art, changed in Paris. But contrary to what one might expect, rather than painting dark, anxious, or violent pictures of war, he created playful, often delicate and amusing fantasies like Sky Blue, which you see down on the right. During World War II, Kandinsky worked in one room of his apartment on the outskirts of Paris in Neuilly-sur-Seine, seemingly oblivious to what was going on around him. In many ways, his late work done in Paris from 1934 to 44, like the art created in Russia from 1915 to 1921, is marginalized, perhaps because it doesn't fit into what we expect. It's very hard to see often, and I think that that may be part of why, aside from the contradiction of including, which I think are recognizable, playful images, but certainly in his compositions, which was part of a series that he had started in 1909 and continued till 1939, it was the meaning of the emotion and the spiritual meaning of what it portrayed. But it's certainly harder to see in the late work, yes. He wrote a lot about the spiritual in art, and including when he was in Paris, he wrote articles in French, very often repeating what he had done earlier, but it's much harder to see in his own work. It's hard to say the reasons why, but certainly when he was in Russia then in 1915 to a certain degree, and then in 1917, he painted many landscapes. And yet if you look at the paintings, they don't look the same as the landscapes he had done in Munich and in Murnau, and it's not because it's a different countryside. They, in a way, became more naturalistic. The colors are much closer to nature. I tend to think that during the First World War, and this real trauma in his life of having to leave everything behind, he really was unable to paint for quite a while. And then when he did, he started more concerned with his new surroundings. The same might be said for when he moved to Paris in 1930, the end of 33 and 34. It was quite a while before he was able to start painting again. And if you think about that in human terms, it's very understandable as to why one can't just automatically write. Writers or artists can't always create. But Kandinsky, when he was in Russia this time, when he painted the dacha with Nina and her sister sitting on the porch, there's no mistaking the style of the painting for earlier ones. He had moved on to something else. Maybe he needed a touchstone of what was around him in his new surroundings. I don't know, because he didn't indicate. He wrote many, many letters. Some of the most important letters are those that he wrote to Gabriele Minter from 1902 into 1916. Where he really talked a lot about himself. He didn't say so much about his paintings, or if you read all the letters that he wrote to Paul Klee or to other artists, because he corresponded really widely and spent hours writing letters, he says very little about paintings. In some, having been reading Kandinsky's letters for ages, you search and you search and you search and you want to find the answer and the clue. And even in writing to artists, or when he wrote to Galka Shire, who lived in California and Los Angeles and was a dealer on whom he counted to have her sell works in this country, he would write about prices. He would give the price in 3 different currencies. He would say what bank account and in dollars or in Swiss francs to deposit the money in, but he would say very little about the meaning of the paintings. It was very curious because he didn't keep a journal, no. He wrote tremendously, especially on the spiritual in art. Point and Line to Plane are his 2 best-known books where he communicated his ideas, but they are really philosophical rather than too specific. I mean, I referred a few times to The Subject of Composition 5, for example. He was very successful, and he cared a lot about this. And during his lifetime, he exhibited widely, such as with the Munich Artists Association, and then with the Blaue Reiter. He sold works to major collectors, and he was very proud of this. And he kept track of who owned what, and of what he exhibited where. The self-awareness of his own production is really fascinating. And then when he was in Russia, it was harder to sell works of art, obviously, especially after the revolution. And because of the revolution, his family lost all of its money. So from that point on in 1917, he really needed money. And then when he came to Germany in 1922, and taught at the Bauhaus, he had dealers in Berlin, some in Munich again, and in Dresden. He exhibited work in Stockholm and all over the place. But he needed money because his relatives in Russia were hungry or needed his help. So he appealed to quite a few people for money, and there was a Kandinsky Society that was founded in 1914 by a German businessman, where collectors could contribute a certain amount of money, which was a stipend for the artist, and a monthly payment, and then they could choose among his watercolors and make selections, be first priority. In Paris, it was different because it was much harder for him. He lost his public when he couldn't exhibit anymore in Germany and when he left Germany. And yes, he did have galleries in Paris, Christian Zervos and Jean Boucher and major figures, but he was not recognized to the same degree, and I think that was very difficult for him. He was very intelligent and very thoughtful, not just a cold intellectual, but also somebody who felt things very, very deeply and who cared tremendously about spiritual values, about his own, what he was trying to achieve, which was really impossibly difficult to paint abstract works and to paint with a unique voice, which changed within his lifetime. And it changed, I think, rather gradually, as I've tried to point out this evening, that it wasn't just like one point, draw a line, end, and move on. It was much more complicated, and he was very, very human in these respects. One interesting point that perhaps most of you know is that Kandinsky studied law, and that was really to be his profession at the beginning. And he also was interested in ethnography and in economic conditions. So he studied economy, he studied law, and in Russia. And only when he was 30 years old did he decide to become a painter. So that this is really a great change. Yes, he knew about art, and he had also worked for his family's printing company, so he was somewhat involved in design elements and interested in this before he left for Munich in 1896. He traveled widely. He read a lot. He knew many artists, so he was very aware of what was going on, especially from about 1904 through 1914, that decade. Kandinsky traveled a lot all through Europe. Austria was nearby, and so he was very involved with exhibitions. He also exhibited in Paris a lot, in Berlin. He knew what was going on, and it's evident in the Blue Reiter Almanac too, how there are paintings by Matisse, by Picasso, and Kandinsky corresponded with Robert Delaunay, for example. So his circle was wide, and his interest was much broader than what we might associate with Munich. Of course, he wasn't from Munich originally. I think he was always Russian. Nothing is complete. Right now I'm working on an addendum to the volumes of the Catalogue raisonné, and which means works that have come to light recently. And it's a small number of works. There are also many lost paintings by Kandinsky. I have a list of probably several hundred works where there's some sort of documentary evidence. Sometimes there's a photograph or a sketch, or Kandinsky kept very, very good records. He kept what were called house Catalogue in German, or in English it's usually called handlist, and it's really a written inventory based upon different categories of works. So there are traces of works, and because of his moving so much, because of the First World War, not to mention the Second World War, all the upheaval in Russia, there are many, many paintings that have gone missing. And then there are works that are, because his inventories were not complete by any means. There are other works that you have no trace of, and they emerge, and the question is whether they are by Kandinsky.